sitting here today with Clyde, who works at a big tech company as a software engineer. And Clyde, I have a few questions I was hoping to ask you. So first off, I just wanted to start with, what is your story? How'd you get to where you are?
So there's a few events that led up to me becoming a software engineer. Primarily, I grew up doing very well in math, and I was honestly very financially motivated. I sort of, when I was about 17 or 18, took a look into the future and tried to figure out what I valued and what I wanted to do. There was no professional calling that truly stood out to me. And with my upbringing, I was sort of corralled into looking into something either in the medical profession or law or engineering. And initially, I actually wanted to learn how to code video games. I played a lot of computer games when I was younger. My father got me a Pentium 4 computer when I was 12 years old. And from there, I tried playing a whole bunch of video games, really. And then about in high school, I took a class in Java. I actually didn't do too hot. I think I got a D my first semester. But it sort of sparked this feeling of being able to put something together. It gave me a taste of what programming was like. Later on in my my early college years, when I was doing my GE, I sort of thought about what I wanted to pursue as an academic career and as a professional career. And during that time, right around about 2012 to 2013, there were hundreds and thousands of stories of these recent college graduates who would graduate and immediately be offered, $150,000 jobs at Google or Facebook or Microsoft. And I figured that since I already had a large jumpstart thanks to a class in high school, that I would pursue a degree in computer science. And with that, I really hope to achieve the same sort of thing that I've heard many times before and have a successful, financially fulfilling career in computer science.
Very nice. Yeah, funnily enough, I too took a Java class and struggled through it when I was briefly in school, and
look at us now.
Now I do it every day. Awesome. So around the whole big tech idea and premise, there's a lot of glamour that I think people associate with it. Is it true?
It is true to a certain extent. I think that there's a lot of snippets that people may advertise online, but to kind of show the behind the scenes of where I got where I am today, I used to work as a very small startup. And to call it a startup is not a glamorous term. I don't say startup in terms of the next Uber or the next DoorDash or the next Facebook. I mean startup in terms of just 5 people just working together because someone had a lot of money and wanted to try to put together a group of college grads and see what worked. That kind of jump-started my progression because I think that it sort of forced an individual to try to learn as best as they can on the job. It's sort of a trial by fire because obviously when you're the one in charge of releasing an application by yourself, all faults and all timelines depend on you. There's no one else to really blame or attribute to the failure or success of the application. Going back to the original question of the glamour of big tech, I think that there is a certain amount of prestige awarded with titles. I think it's very attractive to say that someone works for Google or works for Amazon or works for Facebook. These are all names that carry a lot of weight in the same sense that perhaps going to a Harvard or Stanford or Yale carries the same sort of weight. So I do agree that it is desirable and very envious to be working at these large tech companies for that reason.
Could you describe what the day-to-day might be like at one of these companies? Is it all, free food and biking around on campus like everyone sees in media?
There certainly is a lot of that. The free food is always a nice bonus in any tech company. Of course, this is very team dependent, but it may not be your experience may vary. For people who are just looking for a regular 9-to-5 job, something that pays the bills, I think there are positions in big tech companies that offer that. Their day-to-day is generally not too exciting. They report in for stand-up. They talk to their managers about what they're doing for the week. They talk to their coworkers to try to solve problems. Some of these problems can range from the mundane, such as how big this font's going to look like or what the spacing is between visual elements, or it can be as complex as deciding what data models are going to look like or what the behavior of a certain product should be. There are, of course, the more ambitious efforts for younger people who want to really strive. There's room to grow, in short, where you can be as ambitious or maybe not as ambitious as you like. I've certainly seen people who strive very hard to be the best that they can be at these large tech companies, and their career track progresses accordingly. They work very hard and they elevate themselves and progress through the ranks very quickly, going from software engineering to software management and perhaps even a C-suite.
So a lot of people watching this us are either brand new to coding or thinking about starting to learn programming, and they might have the desire for that big tech lifestyle, salary, all of those things. Do you think it's something they should strive for at first, or is that something that they could maybe set as a further goal? What's your thought in that regard?
I think that it shouldn't be the immediate expectation. I think that a person trying to break into this field shouldn't have that as their first goal. I think that they would need to have a strong foundation to reach that goal. I think that certainly the steps to reach that goal are attainable. I don't believe that they're insurmountable. As someone from a community college background who was there for 5 years before transferring to state school, I do believe that anybody else can break into this profession. I don't think it's walled garden, so to speak.
Do you think there are any characteristics or actions that you use to get where you are?
I think a bit of tenacity is always required for a profession that requires such a mental fortitude. I think that the harder aspects of this profession, and specifically for getting a job into big tech, is the mental fortitude to get through the interviewing process. I think the interviewing process, unfortunately or fortunately, is not akin to the actual day-to-day work that we may find in a big tech company. And I find that the interviewing process is much harder than the day-to-day. So my quick recommendation is to allow oneself to recognize that it is hard, and that it is okay to admit that it is hard, and that someone who's trying to break in here or break into software engineering will need to prepare perhaps a little bit of hardship, perhaps a little bit of frustration, and it's okay if you don't get things right the first time. I certainly failed my first 5 to 6 interviews until I finally got even offered an on-site interview.
I think that's exactly right in my case too. I even for my first 5 years in working in different companies, I don't think I would have passed any big tech interview until I specifically prepared for a big tech interview, just because it's not like your day-to-day at all. It's
Absolutely.
It's a very weird situation. So let me ask you, if you could go back to when you were first learning programming and getting into this field, is there anything you would do differently?
I think that emphasizing algorithms and data structures is very important. I think learning how the basics work, how a hash map works, how an array works, will pay off in dividends. Mostly because the interviewing process for such a large tech company, and even smaller startup companies nowadays, do emphasize that data structure and algorithm portion of the interview so strongly.
Can you name an impactful failure you had that shaped your career?
Absolutely. Once when I was interviewing at Google, I did terribly on all 4 interviewing modules. The first module asked me to perform a recursive search, specifically on how to find a view embedded in a Android XML. They asked me to write an algorithm that would recursively go through each of the nested views to find a specific parent view or a specific child view. Recursion wasn't very much my strong suit. It was something that I hadn't practiced. I think that practicing for these interviews is very crucial. So that was the first module that I definitely failed. The second module was more of an architectural question. And this one I don't fault myself or fault anyone who's trying to break into the profession for failing. Is certainly on their first try. I think it's definitely a harder question that just requires a lot more years of experience to be able to answer properly. But that one was a lot of fibbing. It was just a lot of me just trying to come up with solutions on the fly. And I think my interviewer knew that I was a little bit junior at that point, so he was very kind and was able to give me a few pointers, but I ultimately don't think I did very well on that one. The third module was something specific to Android. It was determining how to load a YouTube page. So as a practice question, they asked me if I were to design the homepage of YouTube on the Android application, how would I do it? And they asked me to go into how network requests are sent, but ultimately I failed to recognize a lot of things and did badly there. In short, each of these interviewing failures was frustrating, but I think that it's important to know that failures can teach a lot, and that once you fail something, you can look and examine at what specifically you need to improve upon in order to ultimately reach that goal, in order to ultimately get that receiving offer the next time you interview for one of these big tech companies.
And I think, the different questions that you just touched upon is a really good example of why, for a lot of people starting out, it's probably not a good place to start. And I agree with you in that regard, because, those questions that you were asked, a lot of developers who are, living a great work life in
Right.
medium and small companies for years and years. They've been working for 5 years at a small company. They would have no idea how to answer a lot of those. A lot of them
Yeah.
don't know what recursion is because it's not really used a lot. And it's,
I agree.
you know, especially if you're like an Android developer or an iOS developer or something in that nature. So I think, you know, those are both really great things that you learn, but also another great example of why this is probably not what you want to aim for initially, but like work your way towards for a lot of people.
Yes. It takes practice.
Yeah. Learning how to interview for those companies is like a job in itself.
Absolutely. I remember spending, right after I graduated, 4 hours, 5 hours a day grinding away at all these different questions just so I can be able to cite them from memory even during the interview process. I also recognize that nerves are something that I also had to contend with. There were many, many times where an interviewer would ask me a question, and if I didn't know the answer right off the top of my head, I would just freeze. I would just be so scared because, you know, it's nerve-wracking. Maybe you land an interview, to land an on-site interview with your favorite tech company, an Amazon or Google, and you want to do well. And it can be extremely intimidating to just be asked a question that you just don't know the answer to.
You know, I've asked a lot of people, like, what are some big red flags, or not even red flags, but mistakes that people make in interviewing? And across the board, people are always saying, like, don't BS. Like, it's okay to say you don't know something, but don't pretend like you don't, or don't try to fake an answer. I think that's, you know.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think there are two parts to that. I think the first part is on the part of the person giving the interview. I feel that when I've given interviews for my company, for potential candidates, that it is my job to sort of help them or coach them through the question. If they're not able to complete some of the first few steps of an interviewing problem, it is my job as the person giving the interviewer to give hints or give tips, because I want this candidate to try to complete the interview as best as they can. And for me, for the person taking the interview, it is my duty or my job to ultimately come up with the question for myself. And if I don't know the answer, or if I don't know the next step, then that could be something I omit. That could be something as simple as saying, I'm not sure what to do next. And hopefully the person giving the interview will be generous enough to sort of give a hint and go from there. Now, obviously this hurts me as the person being interviewed, because obviously it shows a gap in knowledge, which is unfortunately never something you really want to show for the position you're applying for. But we can at least sort of start that conversation and move forward from there.
I know you live around the California and the Bay Area, where tech is a bit
Ubiquitous.
different, and it's a bit, you know, different relative to their average person and the life they live. So my question is, let's say you have a friend that's been totally unrelated field. They've been a teacher, they've been a nurse, whatever they've been doing for years, and they've heard about the life of a programmer, maybe the opportunities, or interested in it, and your friend comes to you and is showing interest. What would be your advice to them, assuming they live in some random city in a non-tech hub? So average person.
I think for the average person, the best thing they can do for themselves to break into the profession is to be able to explain in a very layman way how code works. Even writing something as simple as an hello world would allow them to gain a big understanding of how code works. I think that the toughest paradigm to wrap your head around is that you're giving instructions to a computer, but you're giving these minute, extremely specific instructions one at a time, so that eventually the computer can take all these instructions, put them together, and give you the output that you need. But that's a very high level concept. So I think in short, the best answer is to allow somebody to figure out how to wrap that paradigm into their mind, of understanding that they're basically just telling the computer what to do, and that their specialty, or that software engineering, is the ability to tell the computer what to do in an organized and timely manner.
Right. Now, do you have any recommendations on how they should first start learning programming?
I think that video courses are obviously a great idea. I think that anyone, luckily, can now download a wide variety of programs to get started and coding on their own. It can even be as something as simple as Notepad, Notepad++, or the Notepad that is pre-installed on most Windows machines, or Xcode for iOS on that matter. There are multiple online tutorials that one can take for getting the basics, and I'd start there.
Do you have any recommendations on far as like what they should learn? You know, there's so many different languages out there and types of programming. Is there a good entry point that you think is more so than the others?
This is a tough question to answer. I feel that a lot of people's first language could come down to which profession that they feel that would eventually be suited for them. For example, if a person wanted to get into Android development, I would recommend that they start learning Kotlin as their first language, because that's the language that they'll eventually use professionally. Conversely, if they were going to be a data scientist or someone working with servers, then I would recommend Python, which is also very multi-purpose and would probably be the language that I recommend most to our viewers.
I think that's a great option. Sounds like you should figure out what it is that interests you first and then worry about what you need to learn for that instead
Yes.
of trying to ask people, what language do I learn?
Yes, and as a default, if you need a short and easy answer, I think we can both agree on Python.
Python's a great option. If you were to think about it, do you know if you could name a trait or characteristic that you would say software developers typically have in order to have success in the field?
I think the best trait to have is the ability to admit when you were wrong, and the ability to set aside the ego and focus on the problem at hand. No one likes working with somebody who's extremely argumentative based on no evidence at all. I'm fine with people challenging my opinion. I'm fine with people challenging the decision that I think I've made on a certain project, but we must understand that at the end of the day, we're trying to accomplish a common goal. And I think the ability to collaborate is important.
Yeah, I think that's great. Could you describe what a day in your average work life looks like?
Sure. I'll wake up around 7 a.m., get in the office sometime at 8. I will have breakfast at the in-office cafe. Sometime around 8:30, I'll get to my desk and I'll start going through all of my emails and my Slack messages. I'll try to make a quick to-do list for the day. That could include anything from heads down coding work or coordinating tasks between other developers, or maybe even just attending a whole bunch of meetings for the day.
Do you have any principles when it comes to life and work that you try to live by?
I think nothing comes for free. I think that in order to gain something, one must work for it in some regard. And breaking into this profession is not insurmountable. It's not a tough task, but it does require work.
I agree wholeheartedly on that. Well, that is all I have. I appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you, David.
Yeah. All right. Let's go ahead and pause that.